Hello everyone, I am the Meta Kirby, and welcome to my channel, the Commander Tavern. The Commander Tavern is a channel dedicated to my favorite Magic the Gathering format. The Brewery is a series of this channel showcasing my spicy brews under the deck text. On this episode of the Brewery, I'll be discussing my take on a commander from the Warhammer 40,000 Commander Precons, Marneus Calgar. If you like this deck or any of the cards I'll be mentioning throughout the video, please consider using my TCG Player affiliate link when purchasing those cards. You can find that link down in the description. It'll really help out the channel. But the very best way you can help support the channel is with my Patreon. There are plenty of perks for being a patron, such as early access to certain videos, exclusive deck text, gifts, and more. You can also support my channel for free by simply liking, subscribing, and sharing, which also helps out a lot. I put out a video every Monday, so you don't want to miss out. You can join my Discord server for free if you want to join the Commander Tavern community. All pertinent links are down in the description. Alright, let's get back to the episode. Marneus is a 3/5 Astartes warrior with double strike for 2 generic, 1 white, 1 blue, and 1 black. He has a triggered ability that draws you a card whenever 1 or more tokens enter the battlefield under our control. While that in and of itself makes him an amazing tokens commander, he also has an activated ability that synergizes with its first one. For 6 generic, you create 2 2/2 tokens with vigilance. Unfortunately, this will only draw you 1 card with his Master Tactician ability, but you do get 4 power on the board. These abilities altogether allow Marneus to be a very powerful commander since there are multiple engines to help you achieve infinity. That being said, while I did include some of these game-ending combos, I built this deck to be a bit grindier and more mid-range. While this makes it quote-unquote fairer, it does make it slower. So if you want to build Marneus without always going to infinity and focus more on tokens and token strategies, this list might give you some ideas. But if you still want to win for games that are too grindy, try comboing off for the win once you assemble the necessary engines. While there are literally hundreds of token creators that you can choose from, I decided to go with plenty of ways to get tokens for free with no effort. What I mean by that is those triggered effects that trigger on their own without investing any mana in them. Well, mostly. So let's start with Emeria Angel, Felidar Retreat, Retreat to Emeria, and Field of the Dead. These trigger from playing lands, which is something you're going to be doing anyways. The deck is also running all 9 fetch lands, so you can trigger these twice in the same turn. In order to maximize Field of the Dead, the entire deck is singleton right down to its lands. That means that all 6 basics are also different, one of each basic land as well as one of each snow basic. So once it's online, it'll always trigger. Ancient Gold Dragon and Lucille have triggers tied to combat. The former triggers on combat damage and the latter on attacking. The dragon might have a hefty casting cost, but once it hits an opponent, it has an average result of 10 tokens. 10 1/1 flyers is nothing to scoff at, and that's just the average result. Lucille has the added bonus of forcing the defending player to sacrifice a creature on its trigger, so it can also function as interaction. Dalee's Reverent Medium and Dread Feast Demon also trigger for free, but at the beginning of the end step. Dalee's triggers on opponents' end steps too, potentially creating even more 1/1 flyers for creating tokens outside of your turn. The Demon is a great way to turn weenie tokens into copies of itself. Turning 1/1 tokens into 6/6 flyers is quite menacing, especially when this copy effect becomes exponential. Speaking of copy effects, Legion Loyalty, Helm of the Host, Phantom Steed, Astral Dragon, Mimic Vat, Fairy Artisans, and Saw in Half all create some form of copy token. The first 3 are tied to combat. The enchantment gives all creatures we control Myriad, which is quite busted, thus the heavy casting cost. However, while only one instance of Myriad triggers Marneus only once, he will trigger off of each instance of Myriad for different creatures. So if we attack with 3 different creatures, he'll trigger 3 different times. The equipment is absolutely busted here since there are so many amazing creatures to create non-legendary copies of, starting with Marneus himself, but we'll see plenty more creatures throughout the video. The creature is an interesting one because it can also serve to protect a creature from spot removal. Just flash it in and essentially O-ring it. Then whenever it attacks, you create a token copy of it, which is amazing with triggered effects from other things in the deck. The only downside is sacrificing the token at the end of combat. However, the deck capitalizes even on that, which we'll see soon. The dragon is absolutely ridiculous here, especially if we're able to keep copying it, even with the previously mentioned Phantom Steed. Being able to twice more copy our best non-creature permanent is so amazing, especially with the effects in the deck we'll soon see. Mimic Vat can also potentially copy our creatures if they get imprinted on it. However, it can also do so for opponents' creatures. Speaking of which, the fairies also do something similar but entirely for free. The only downside to the fairies is that the token changes with each new creature an opponent has entering the battlefield. That being said, we can still make the most of it, especially with the effects in the deck. The sorcery is some amazing tech that can be used to great effect in the deck, especially with all the effects that care about our creatures dying. However, being able to twice copy that creature we're killing to it is an amazing effect in and of itself, and very easy to make the most of. Smothering Tithe, Grim Hireling, Pitiless Plunderer, and Revel in Riches also have token creating effects based on triggers, all for free too. The best thing about them is that they create treasures which help the deck's mana acceleration considering it's not green. Smothering Tithe can be a bit annoying to opponents, but at least the deck isn't running wheel effects. It should be noted that you can go infinite with Smothering Tithe and Wedding Ring. While I don't run this combo in the deck because I don't personally like how the ring works, it's absolute madness here. Let me go over it quickly. Whenever you draw a card, an opponent controlling the Wedding Ring token draws a card, triggering Smothering Tithe. If they don't pay the tax, you create a treasure token. If it's your turn and you're controlling Marneus, you draw a card. This triggers their Wedding Ring token, drawing a card. If they don't pay the tax, you do it all over again. If you have more cards in your library than that opponent, you just deck them, while also keeping a very fat hand. However, this is quite risky since you will be close to decking yourself, meaning that you can win with Thassa's Oracle if you wanted to. Like I mentioned in the intro of this episode, it's very easy to combo off with Marneus. Returning to the mentioned cards, even if you don't go infinite with Smothering Tithe, it's still a good way to create treasures for free. Grim Hireling has the potential of creating up to 6 treasure tokens per combat step if you attack all opponents with enough creatures to at least get one through. As a bonus, you can also pay 1 black and sacrifice X treasures to potentially kill off a creature at sorcery speed. Pitiless Plunderer triggers whenever a creature you control dies. Notice that it doesn't specify non-token creatures, so expect this to trigger a ton as you play and are sacrificing tokens for value or having them die in combat. Revel in the Riches does the same thing but when opponents' creatures are dying. In any case, its true value is the potential win con effect when you control 10 or more treasures during the upkeep in which it triggers. With only 4 sources of creating treasures in the deck, this might not be that valuable, but on its own it still creates treasures, so it's still possible. Speaking of insta-wins, Halo Fountain is also included in the deck. While you need 15 tapped creatures and 5 white mana to activate that game-ending ability, this deck is constantly making tons of creature tokens, so that shouldn't be an issue. However, this artifact is still useful since its first ability creates a 1/1 token and its second one has you draw a card. And with Marneus out, you only need to use its first ability since he will draw you the card anyways, saving you the mana. Going back to effects that give tokens on triggers, we have Nader Kraken. Unfortunately, this one isn't free since you have to pay 1 generic each time you draw a card to get that tentacle token. That being said, this alone is enough to also trigger Marneus as many times as you're able to pay for that ability. Let's quickly see how. Since the tentacle token triggers Marneus, drawing you a card, that card draw triggers the Kraken, creating a sort of feedback loop. However, like I mentioned, this will only happen so long as you can pay for the effect. Fortunately, you can go infinite with it thanks to Ashnod's Altar and Phyrexian Altar. All you have to do is sacrifice that tentacle token to either of these in order to keep paying for Nadir Kraken's trigger. With the first one you get infinite colorless mana too. Just be careful you don't deck yourself. But if you do want to keep going until you deck yourself, don't forget Thassa's Oracle and similar effects. However, even if you don't go infinite, the altars are amazing at getting value from all of those tokens being created. Sadistic Hypnotist, Mind Slash, and Attrition are more ways of making the most of our creature tokens by disrupting opponents. Granted, we still have to pay 1 black mana to the last 2, but we're still getting plenty of value from them, especially with keeping our opponent's hands free of cards and boards free of creatures. Speaking of, Martyr's Bond, Dictate of Erebos, and Grave Pact do an even better job at keeping boards clear of creatures. Anytime any of our tokens die, we forcing opponents to sacrifice things of their own. While the black enchantments are tied solely to creatures, the white enchantment can hit anything else except lands. So each time we sacrifice a treasure, all opponents have to sacrifice an artifact. Brutal. The Imperium would be proud. Legion's Landing, Castle Ardenvale, Jeldoran Outpost, Fairy Formation, Luminarch Ascension, Horn of Valhalla, and Defenders of Humanity are ways of creating tokens, but these don't trigger and aren't free. Well, Legion's Landing does create a 1/1 for free off of its Enter the Battlefield trigger, but once it transforms into Adonto the First Fort, you have to pay mana and tap it to create a token, same as Castle Ardenvale and Jeldoran Outpost. However, since these are lands, they don't take up a slot in the deck. They are quite costly to activate though, but they're good in a pinch. Fairy Formation and Luminarch Ascension could create flying tokens at will, although the enchantment needs to have the necessary number of counters on it to do so. The Fairy's ability is a bit costly to activate, but it draws us a card on its own. So with Marneus, we're getting a 1/1 flyer and drawing 2 cards for just 4 mana, which isn't that bad. Plus, it's a 5/4 with flying, which is something to scoff at. The last 2 can create X amount of tokens as an amazing mana sink. They're also useful afterwards since you can cast Horn of Valhalla after sending it on an adventure as a pretty busted equipment given your board state. And the enchantment helps you recover said board state after a board wipe by once again sinking mana into it and exiling it. It makes opponents wanting to wipe the board feel that much more helpless in doing so. Liliana Dreadboard General is another activated way of creating a creature token, but since she's a planeswalker, you can only do so once during your turn at sorcery speed. but that's fine because her -4 ability is a great way to help oppress the board. Granted, her ultimate is hardly used in the game, but the main reason for running her is her triggered ability. Each time one or more of our creatures die, we draw a card. She draws us into a ton of cards, probably more than even Marneus. In fact, the deck aims to further capitalize on tokens to draw us cards, with Mentor of the Meek, Skull Clamp, Idol of Oblivion, and Benny Brack's Zoologist. While the Mentor requires paying 2 generic each time it triggers, it should be triggering quite often, given that most of the creature tokens in the deck are either 1/1s or 2/2s. It's a shame that Inspiring Commander hasn't been printed on paper yet. This would have been absolutely busted in this deck and much better than Mentor of the Meek. There's absolutely no reason for this to be digitally exclusive, given that it works on paper. But I digress. In any case, Skull Clamp can also draw us a ton of cards but for just 1 mana each time. Granted, it needs to be equipped to a 1 toughness creature, but this deck has no shortage of ways of creating such tokens. The last 2 draws cards from tokens entering the battlefield, but they're different than Marneus. We have to tap the Idol at some point in that turn, and Benny triggers at the beginning of each end step and only once, regardless of how many tokens we created. But at least they're free to use. Curiosity Crafter is also free to use since its trigger doesn't require any mana payment. This card is absolutely busted here since it triggers per creature token. If we connected with 20 creature tokens, we draw 20 cards. It also has a built-in way to give us no maximum hand size. The deck's also running Thought Vessel, Decanter of Endless Water, and Reliquary Tower for that same reason. The deck draws into a ton of cards, so it's great to be able to keep our fat hands. Plus, non-green decks need mana rocks anyways, and the land doesn't take up a slot in the deck. Soundwave Sonic Spy has a similar trigger as Curiosity Crafter, but for stealing instants and sorceries from defending players' graveyards. If we hit enough combat damage, we can cast bigger instants and sorceries with it. However, he also creates tokens if he's in its converted form. Whenever we cast a spell, we create a creature token, either Ravage or Laserbeak, depending on the parity of the spell cast. However, once we do, he converts back to its creature form, allowing us to do it all over again. Further value for tokens comes from Anointed Procession and Kaya Geist Hunter. And by further value, I mean double the value. While the enchantment does this inertly, Kaya requires activating her second ability to do so. Since she loses loyalty counters in the process, we can't do it every turn. However, if we know we're going to create a ton of tokens during our turn, we just activate her first before we do. Her first ability is still useful though, since she gives Death Touch to all of our creatures. This helps our weenies trade for any big creatures that block them. Speaking of, Vault of Archangel is also included for the same reason. It might be a bit costly to activate, but giving all of our creatures Death Touch and Lifelink is too good to pass up, especially since it doesn't take up a slot in the deck for being a land. Not forgetting Marneus himself, Hearthstone and Training Grounds help make it easier to activate him to create those creature tokens. While the deck has plenty of ways of creating tokens and making the most of them, don't forget that we can still activate Marneus in a pinch. These just make it easier to do so since 6 generic mana is too brutal a payment to make. The following cards are needed by every commander deck, which are the deck's Card Advantage, Interaction, and Mana Acceleration. While the deck has no issues with drawing cards, we still need to protect our board and interact with our opponents. Fierce Guardianship, Swan Song, and Offer You Can't Refuse, Negate, Counterspell, and Mana Drain provide a decent enough suite of counter magic. These not only help us protect our own combos, but prevent other players from comboing off as well. Cyclonic Rift, Generous Gift, and Vindicate help deal with anything that does get through. While the deck has plenty of ways of synergistically interacting with opponents, it's never a bad thing to run a couple of catch-alls in your deck regardless. Mystic Sanctuary is a great way of getting these back too. With enough fetch lands in the deck that can get this at instant speed, we can do so in response to drawing a card if we want to perform that pro-gamer move. Lightning Greaves, Swiftfoot Boots, Champion's Helm, and Giant's Amulet help us protect Marneus as well as any other key creature in play. While the deck isn't 100% dependent on Marneus to function, a lot of the creatures have amazing effects, so it's worth it to protect them. As a bonus, we can also get a 4/4 Giant Wizard off of the Amulet if we wanted to get another token. As for Mana Acceleration, the deck's running Soul Ring, Felwar Stone, Arcane Signet, Talisman of Dominance, Talisman of Hierarchy, and Talisman of Progress. Since there are only 6 basic lands in the deck, land-based Mana Acceleration effects might not be as good as in other decks. However, these rocks are cheap enough that they'll accelerate us well before anyone overloads a Vandal Blast. The rest of the deck is just the rest of the lands. The deck's running all 9 fetch lands, all 3 shock lands, all 3 snow duels, all 3 slow duels, Raffine's Tower, Reflecting Pool, Command Tower, and Ancient Tomb, as well as 1 of each basic land and snow basic land, as previously mentioned, to maximize Field of the Dead. And as with all of my deck techs, you can build your mana base according to your budget. Whether you include more expensive cards or even cheaper cards is up to you. You do you. This brew is just an idea of how to build around Marneus Calgar. Marneus definitely has the potential to be a very strong commander, especially if you go all in with the combo potential by including all the infinite combos that go with him. Thassa's Oracle, Fast Mana, etc. However, I decided to go a more mid-range route with a couple of ways to insta-win in case games drag on too long or if you can't seem to get the win. Games do have to end after all. If you're interested in the decklist of this spicy brew of mine, you can find a link to it down in the description. I would like to thank all my patrons for supporting me, and a quick shout out to all my higher tier patrons, the brewers, for their patronage. I'd also like to thank anyone using my TCG Player affiliate link. That also helps out the channel. And to everyone, thanks for watching this episode of The Brewery on the Commander Tavern. I am the Kirby, and happy brewing.